Welcome in, everyone. We're just waiting on a few more people, so we'll just wait a couple more minutes. This is always the last minute scramble where people are texting me for the links. So Jodie, is there anyone else in the waiting room?
There's no one in there currently, but I'll keep an eye on it.
Okay. I've just sent it to a couple of people, so just give it 60 seconds for them to get on. We'll probably make a start, folks, now. And Jodie, you can let people in whenever they come in. So everybody, welcome. Thank you so much for coming to this creative conversation with Monica McWilliams. We're very excited about today. My name's Adam McGuigan, and I'm the Artistic Director of Wek the Beast. So we've been doing these series of creative conversations over the past few years, really inspired by how we could reach new audiences throughout lockdown. And it's really been something that we found there's been a niche for. It's an opportunity for people to engage in topics that are aimed at facilitating conversation, especially with the Irish and specifically the Northern Irish diaspora. We found that there was lots of activities for the Irish diaspora, but with a particular focus on issues from the North was something that people really responded well to. So I can see on the chat, we've got some people who have been here before, and we've got some people who this is their first time. So everybody, really welcome. It's a series of creative conversations. So we have another one happening next month, which is about having one foot in each island and being Irish with an English accent. So I'll give you some more information about that at the end of this one. So the program is being supported by the Irish government's immigrant support program. So we're really grateful to their ongoing support. We've got a little bit of a different format tonight. Usually there's a lot of satire and we have some performances. But when I read Monica's book, which I've got here with all my notes and everything, when I read Monica's book, Stand Up, Speak Out, it really spoke to me. And it made me feel that it would be such an opportunity to devote the whole session to asking Monica some questions and allowing her to speak about some of the stories from the book. And critically, we want to hear from you as well. So we're going to have a couple of opportunities for you to ask questions tonight. So you can do that in a series of ways. You can do it in the chat or you can put up your hand, but I'll let you know whenever there's an opportunity for us to do that. I just want to introduce Jodie, first of all. So Jodie is our Zoom queen for tonight. So Jodie, do you want to just say hi and the screen will come to you?
Hi guys, so I'm the administrator for Wake the Beast. If you have any issues, technical or otherwise, during the Zoom, just go to the chat and there'll be the option for two. And instead of everyone, just pick Jodie, Wake the Beast, and then you can message me privately and we can try and sort it out as quickly as possible. Enjoy.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So welcome, Monica. How are you doing? You're so welcome to be here this evening.
Thank you, Adam. Delighted to be here.
Good. Well, we've got a lot to talk about. So Monica and I had a bit of a catch up yesterday. But before we get to that, I just wanted to say when I read this book, Monica, I had such a connection to it. It was unbelievable. I felt such an affinity to it. And when I told one of my friends this, they looked at me like I was crazy or like my ego had gone out of control. And I had to rectify it and say, up until the point she became a human rights activist, a co-signatory of the Good Friday Agreement, and on the global stage, an ambassador for human rights. I kind of meant the first few chapters whenever you were talking about going to Kelly's, you grew up in Kilray, you know, you talked about going to Port Stewart for your mum and dad's wedding anniversary to the Montague. There was so many things. And even when you went to work in America, I said, I bet you it's going to be Wildwood. It's going to be Wildwood. And you also worked on the prom in Wildwood like I did as well. So I just found such a connection to the book, but also, I mean, it was such an insight into such an impressionable period in all our shared history. So it's a complete page turner. So it's an absolute honor to be having a chance to chat to you tonight. Also, you talk about Kilray. My grandfather was from Kilray, and his father, Pat McGuigan, had a furniture store on Bridge Street for many years. So yeah, there's definitely a lot. I think we could have a good glass of wine after this some point, and we can just chin wag. But just moving on, Monica, to your brilliant book, I just wanted to talk about you were told once by an elected official to sit down and shut up, hence the name of the book, Stand Up and Speak Out. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to the idea of writing the book and what that process was actually like?
Well, I had wanted to write the book for a long time, but anybody that knows me knows that it takes a long time for me to shut up and sit down. So it was the lockdown, Adam, that eventually forced me into sitting down and taking out all my diaries, which I had kept since I was about 10 years of age. And so I had plenty to fall back on in those early years. Mm-hmm. And then I also wanted to record what had happened behind the scenes in the peace agreement, the stories that were never told and couldn't be told. And so 25 years have passed. And I think it is time now, and it won't be breaking any confidences in terms of the things that we were doing, but we couldn't say we were doing. Yeah. And I also wanted to talk about the connections between Northern Ireland and other places that I am now visiting in terms of the various conflict regions that I'm going to and have been going to for the last 10 years. So there was lots of connections and connectedness at a time when Brexit had happened. But it really came about because I'd been invited to do Desert Island Discs. And the publisher heard that piece on Desert Island Discs, and I'd picked pieces of music that brought me back to various stages of my life. And I thought, well, that's how I could probably write the chapters if I think about those. And I wasn't sure where to start. I wasn't sure, like most memoirs, to start with my childhood or to start with what people think was seminal, which was the night of the Good Friday Agreement. But I found it easier simply to start from my background, and because I wanted to show how formative those early years were, and particularly if you grew up in Northern Ireland in the 60s and 70s. So the Stand Up and Speak Out was a great title in that it was kind of ready-made. I say in the very first sentence, I sat down to write this because I was once told to shut up and sit down as an elected representative in a public forum. And I refused to do it. but it was caught in television, and everyone at the time had seen it. And actually, a bit like the Oscars, the other night, people came up to me in the supermarkets and in the shops and said, "That was terrible what they've said to you. I'm going to vote for you the next time round." And I thought, gee, I hope that's not the only thing I'm ever remembered for.
Of course. Well, I mean, you just spoke about your early years, and it's lovely. At the end of the book, you kind of reflect back on how much you owe a lot to those formative years. Can you tell us just a wee bit about, what it was like, where you grew up, and what your upbringing was like?
Well, as you know, that village in Kilrea, and it was a lovely country place to grow up. There was a local mart, and my father was a cattle dealer. So that was really important, being able to engage at a very early age at the mart with the men, which was unusual for 6, 7, 8-year-old child. But also, it was a very segregated town. There's no question about that. And you already know the school system was segregated. So from the age of 4 till the age of 18, we really did not mix with either our Protestant neighbours or with the kids that should have been playing alongside us. So those were the stories I wanted to tell, and some of them are quite humorous. The people were working quite hard at keeping us separate rather than bringing us together at times. But it was a very happy childhood. And I wanted to show the influence of my father, who was a great storyteller and a talker, and my mother, who was a great listener. And I say that I was more like my father, and my sister, who I dedicate the book to, was more like my mother. But it was those relationships, the relationships with your parents, my relationships as a young girl with my brothers, my relationship with my sisters, and how that all influenced me in later life. And I guess watching my father negotiating at the markets, buying and selling cattle, and the quiet way they did it, but also, and it was noisy, but also the spitting of the hands, the custom that when you struck a deal, that's what you did. And I thought about that a lot when I came to negotiate the peace agreement, that our word had to be good, that when you made a deal, you had to bring it forward. Otherwise, you wouldn't be trusted again. And all of those things brought me back to what I had learned as a child, and also my education, which was free, which was like a gift to us, because my parents never had that opportunity. And I talk in the book in the first chapter about their background, which was fairly impoverished, but how much they valued education and how important they saw it for us. It was our ticket to wherever we wanted to go. So I felt all of that was important to put into the book, especially now in the context of Northern Ireland and its future and what we value most.
I mean, there's very humorous. There's lots of very serious, poignant parts in the book, but also there was times whenever I literally spat out my tea. One of them was when you spoke about your neighbors, the Cares. Do you want to tell us about that little episode?
Well, I don't know who had told the Cares, who were the same age as us, that Protestants were better than Catholics. And honest to God, we were only about 5 or 6 years of age. And for kids to be told that, you're better because of the religion you were born into. And we wanted, or certainly I wanted to prove that wasn't the case. And when my parents got away one day, I decided that my brothers and sisters and I should take everything out of the house and put it out on the street, and that they should do the same. And that when we would have a look at each other's furniture and whatever bits and pieces they had, we could then decide who was better than the other. And I found a box of chocolates that my mother had hidden somewhere in the house, and they couldn't beat that. And so I had to then say, well, I'm afraid we won, so we are better than you.
And that settled it.
Well, it settled it. My mother came home and was absolutely affronted that she had reared children that would be such brats, and insisted that I go down and apologize. Everything was always my fault, by the way. And I did go down and apologize. And I found it wasn't that hard to say sorry, but I say in the book, what annoyed me more was that they weren't told to come up and say sorry to us, and that would have squared it off. But later in the book, I say that they did come to play with us in the hayloft, because our hayloft was just the biggest playground you could have had when the hay came in. And we had the baling twine, and we tied that, and those were our swings. And I say, and I hope they don't take it in a derogatory way, that I said, and even the cares came to play.
Oh my God. Wonderful image, though. I mean, I laughed at that image when your mum came back and you were lugging the crockery and the furniture back into the house, and they were seeing what was going on. So I'm buttering you up, Monica, because I want to get the film rights to the book. So I'm keeping you on my side. But another lovely image which really made me laugh was, I'm just going to read from the book here as well. On May Day, we put on our white veils and joined the nuns in a procession around the convent lake. When I was 7 years old, singing Ave Maria and holding bluebells in my hands, I felt like an angel. I thought it was a beautiful image. But the angel thing wasn't to stay for very long, if I'm honest. There was an interesting story, and I think if your colleagues in the Northern Ireland Assembly had put money on who was running around with a gun when they were at school, it probably wouldn't have been you they would have put money on. But that was the case. Do you want to tell us about you on the run with the gun?
Yeah, but let me bring you back, Adam, to that primary school. And I did want to be an angel, because my first teacher seemed to me to be like an angel, a beautiful nun. The last teacher in that school was far from it. So there was a big difference between them. And I told those stories, and how different very early on in your life you learn who can be a bit of a bully and who can be a real mentor to you. But so the first two teachers were great, but I was a bold brat. And I actually pulled one of the nuns' veils off in the classroom because I was so bored. And she had the makings of me. And she got me to mind her budgie, to run messages between the classrooms, and to be the page turner when she played the piano. So we made up and we became best buddies. I don't say in the book that she came to visit me right into her 80s. Wow. I would bring her to my house. Because she was really a great teacher. But they had a motto in that school, which was, I learned later, when sleeping women awake, mountains will move. And they made a poster, and that's the poster that I kept in my election office. And I often said that women weren't sleeping. But when you wake up, you certainly want to move some mountains. And that's what I wanted to do when I got to secondary school, because you remember the 11 plus. Mm-hmm. And in the book, I talk about how awful it was that we were separated. My best friend went to a different school. The fat envelope came to me, the thin envelope went to her. Mm. And it's a bittersweet moment when you realize that you're not going to be able to stay friends throughout your school years. And so the teacher, I had a wonderful English teacher at school, and she was a bit of a nervous wreck at times, probably from teaching people like me. And she said that she would love if she had a gun to explain the war poem, the naming of the parts. But she said it, and I wanted to be a pleaser. So I went home to my father, and he had already taught me how to dismantle the gun that he used to keep the dogs away from the sheep. And I'd often been out with them at night. And he didn't think anything of it, and I put it in my hockey bag and took it to school on the bus, and put it all together and set it on the desk before she came in. And if she was nervous before, she was certainly hysterical when she saw that gun sitting on the table. And I was sent home, and my father was told to come and get me. And he, sensible man that he was, said, "Oh, come home the way you went, get on the bus and put the gun bag in your hockey bag," which I did early in the day. And I sat alone in the cafe at the bus station. And in the book, I said I had enough trouble for one day, so I decided not to buy any of the single cigarettes that were on sale in those days to schoolgirls. And I sat and drank whatever, my Fanta, and behaved because I was a girl on the run with a gun. And this was right at the start of the Troubles. So you can imagine what should have been extraordinary was perfectly ordinary. And it was a tale that I told on Desert Island Discs. And the Belfast Telegraph ran with a big story. Who do you think was the girl in the run with the gun in Northern Ireland who became a politician?
My God. There's another couple of stories which I won't embarrass you about, but there was one that struck me about smuggling cider from Coleraine into the Marianne Hall with your friend Jill. But if you want to know that, you have to read that in the book. I just want to take you back, Monica, to something you said. It was a passage that really struck me about being segregated. And it really struck me in one of the early chapters. When we were teenagers, there were fewer opportunities to mix with Protestants than there had been when we were younger. We danced in different halls and went to different schools. For the 7 years that we shared the same bus every morning, we rarely exchanged a word. The Protestant boys attended the Inst and we went to the convent. They called us the Virgins on the Hill. The nuns made sure it stayed that way. I wanted to know what it would be like to date a Protestant boy, but I could only dream about that. From my bedroom window, I could see the fun the boys and the girls were having at the Young Farmers Club dance in the Orange Hall. Fraternizing was permitted between the sexes, but not between the two religions. There was zero tolerance for anyone who mixed up the rules. Just found that really striking.
Yep, and that's the way it was right up until we were 18. And then I talk about the difference of going to university and being thrown in together. And I see that to this day as later as a university teacher. The impact of kids not growing up together, not sharing their education or learning together, but also dancing together and playing sport together. Later there became a cross-community festival in the town, but there wasn't one then when I grew up. But around the fairy tree, we had a fairy thorn tree, which we were told should never be cut down because the fairies will come back and haunt you. Well, they did cut it down, and instead of the fairies haunting them town, they actually brought them together, brought Protestants and Catholics together, and that festival, I think, is still going on to the present day. At least I think they're trying to revive it now. But there wasn't much crossover. And even, it's quite shocking, isn't it, Adam, to think you travel on a bus together, and because of our school uniforms. And I overheard them saying, we knew we were the Virgins on the Hill. Probably didn't have much meaning for us in those days. But I also talk about how their schools looked so much better than ours. They had a swimming pool and I would walk past it and totally envy this. But really there wasn't much difference. And in the debating contests, we felt we had to beat them again, the same old thing, to prove that we were better. And that really shouldn't be what it's about. It's about your skill sets as opposed to which religion is competing against the other for winning prizes.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about that. I remember us coming home on the bus as well, and we had Dominican blazers, and coming into Ballymoney, sometimes you really had to know when to take off your blazer and to put it in your bag. You learned that very, 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 very quickly. It's almost a second sense or an additional sense that you had. But I mean,
I'm sad to say that's still the case.
Yeah.
And even when my kids were growing up, I say in the book, my brother went to school in Ballymoney to Dalriada, which was unusual because he would have been a Catholic boy in a predominantly Protestant school. But comparing the two curriculums, they were identical. And we were going through school at the same time.
Yeah.
So, that was also something that I felt we're both learning the same subjects, but under different roofs. And it wasn't just a gender thing, it was also a religion thing. But my own kids would have even said that in terms of the sports they were playing. And I felt something needs to change by the time they had grown up. They're now in their 30s. But it was quite difficult because they were born in the 80s, the late 80s, and the Troubles were still at the height. And sad to say, they had to, when one of them was playing with a hurley stick, he had to put it in a brown paper bag and wrap it and keep it under his coat because he was traveling and walking through an area where that would have been seen as a weapon. And strangely, it's not. It's simply something that kids play for sport.
Yeah.
And I often had to sit him down and tell him to be careful. I don't tell that in the book because it was just the norm, as you know, Adam. You learn very early how to keep yourself safe.
Well, that was another thing that kind of struck me. There's so many instances, I kind of did say this, but so many instances of tragedy, that reflect the time that you were in, and at different stages in the book. I mean, it was so peppered with different things that happened, you know, unfortunately famous events or bombs or things that have happened. But you also, you know, spoke about how that kind of helped you gravitate towards civil rights and how that was a real attraction to you, and especially in the 70s, you know, after you'd studied and everything. You're all right to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I started very early in my life. I was only 15 years of age when I joined the civil rights movement. It came to the town. We'd watched what had happened to the United States and the Martin Luther King movement. We felt this is a peaceful movement. It's non-violent. Everybody in the town was involved. And when the march was called in McGilligan, for McGilligan Strand the week before Bloody Sunday, all our neighbours were going, and there were Protestants involved too. People would have seen it as predominantly a nationalist cry. But what I say in the book is that there were many Protestant families that were impoverished as well. But it was predominantly more on the Catholic side. So it was a very class thing when it came to the Protestant side, because they would have said the big house unionists didn't look after them. And of course, nationalists felt that the issue of the vote and fair employment and discrimination in social housing was much more predominant in the Catholic community, and that is definitely the case. And so I marched, as I said, one man, one vote. Of course, later as a feminist, that would have been seen as one person, one vote. But that movement hadn't swept across the Atlantic in the same way as the civil rights movement had. So McGilligan was a real turning point, and that's why I give some detail about what happened that day, and why what I saw actually similar in Syria, that when you react to a peaceful protest with very oppressive and repressive methods to keep the protest down, and on that day it was CS gas, and it was rubber bullets, big, thick rubber bullets, which if fired at short distance can kill you or blind you. And people were going down all around me and choking with the gas. The army had got angry because the wind was blowing in the wrong direction and it blew the gas back in their faces, and they hadn't put on their masks. And then they took out their batons. And what's iconic about that now is it's the picture of John Hume going forward as the MP, remonstrating with the commander of the British Army, and the row between them, and him saying, "These people have nothing but sand in their hands. Why are you doing this?" And for me, we went home that day and it sunk into my head, this is not good. This is not going the way that we had thought. And people got angry and bitter. And then Bloody Sunday happened. And this is the 50th anniversary this year. And we've just come through a lot of what has happened. And, you know, those memories were very strong in my head when I sat down to write the book. But little did I know, and I said this to the Syrians when they also went out into their squares and public squares to make their pleas for equality and fairness and rights, that little did I know that ours would go on for 30 years. And the first year that we went to do some training there, they thought it would be over in a year. And look at it, it's now into its 11th year. And poor Ukraine, we're probably facing a long war there. I hope not. But that was something that I felt, you know, as a young teenager, you had lots of adrenaline. And you were, you know, thinking this is great, civil rights march, peaceful march, thousands out, and it'll be all over and the demands will be met. And if you had to turn history pages back, I bet the demands that should have been met more quickly at that stage would have resolved a great deal of difficulties later on. And that's the whole point about civil rights. Yeah,
it'd be interesting to actually pick up that idea maybe towards the end of the conversation, because I think that's really interesting. Yeah, I was really struck by something you said in it, that you had heard somewhere, I'm paraphrasing this, but you had heard somewhere that it takes the same amount of years that you're in conflict to actually get out of conflict as well. Which, you know, when you're talking about 30 years, it's very striking to hear that.
Yeah. That was one of the Mennonites who came to Northern Ireland, John Paul Lederach, and he's written a book about that. And when he said that at a meeting I was at, I thought, wow, that means another 30 years. Well, here we are on the cusp of 25 years after the peace agreement. And I'm working as hard today to resolve this conflict. I'm on the commission now to disband armed groups. Well, you might well ask me, Adam, how come you're doing that 25? Well, it's almost 30 years since they called their ceasefires. So it turned out he was right.
There was a really, again, I'm quoting Ted Heath's Home Secretary, Reginald Moulding, after a visit to Northern Ireland, said, when he came back to London, said, "For God's sake, bring me a large Scotch. What a bloody awful country." And, you know, you were talking about around that time of internment, it was pretty awful. There was really, you know, there was, you know.
Yeah, they got that wrong. And as I say, he made that quote, and I quote it in the book, and then I said it was a bloody awful country, but not for the reasons he thought. It was because they were getting it wrong, the people that they were interning, as it's now coming out, because this is also the anniversary of that, and it's all coming out that the people they were picking up were not the people. Their intelligence was so poor. And again, when you do that, it creates a great deal of anger, and probably led to people then taking up violent methods to respond when there was no intentions of doing that. Yeah. And some of those people were our neighbours, and some were very young. So some people would say that was a recruitment ground for the future IRA rather than the opposite. And then the interrogation methods that were used, the 5 techniques that were also used in Guantanamo Bay. And the case then was taken to Europe by the Irish government, to the European Court of Human Rights. And the British government was found at fault for inhumane and degrading treatment. Today, we would argue perhaps it should have been torture. But again, it shows that, you know, if you do not put the basic foundation of rights down when you're looking at the issues of law and order, then you shouldn't expect people to have allegiance to a country that does that. And obviously, I speak about what happened after Bloody Sunday in the Widgery Tribunal, which took another 40 years before another tribunal said that that one was a whitewash. I learned a lot in my early years that I did not know was sinking in to when I would become Chief Commissioner for Human Rights. Yeah. And what creates good practice and what will be damaging and harmful. And in the long run, you will pay the costs.
I'm just wanting to bring up, taking it in a different direction. We talked about religious discrimination, but I was also struck by you saying that women's rights always took second fiddle to religious discrimination. And you talked about Europe in the book. You talk about the Discrimination Act. And again, there's lots of evocative images of there's no women politicians from Northern Ireland in the EU Parliament. So where was the impetus for the Discrimination Act to be implemented? And that's such a big strand of the book.
Yeah,
I'm interested.
And it was the Labour government were in government at the time, and it was they who said, the problem in Northern Ireland is religion, it's not sex discrimination. So we see no reason to extend the Sex Discrimination Act that we have introduced into Britain to Northern Ireland. And so that was our first march. And so we marched in Stormont in 1975. And that's when we got our first win, which was the Sex Discrimination Act getting extended and opening up of the Equality Commission. But there are other funny stories there, because I try not to make it too heavy, because I want the next generation to understand that some of us tried to lay the foundations, and they should not think. Now, today, I hear them saying, what's all this women's movement stuff? Sure, we're all fine. I want them to read this and see that you can go backwards as well as forwards. You can have those things taken away. And I tell that story about Eileen Evanson, who went into the pub in Belfast because we women were not allowed to drink in the bar. We had to sit quietly in the lounge where nobody could see us. And she alerted the journalists and the TV cameras to come and watch her being thrown out. And in the book, I also talk about how I was thrown out when I went in to tell my brother that I was, you know, now waiting on him to give me a lift home, and the barman said, "Get out." And I said, "Do you expect me to shout in from the street?" And he said, "I don't care. There's no woman will ever be in my bar." And what we realized was that although the Sex Discrimination Act had been introduced, it was only for employment, and it then needed to be extended to services and facilities. And so that's why, another reason why I wrote the book, was because those things get written out and people don't have the recall and the recollection of how hard we fought for those, and how you can't, it's like a snowball, you continue to build on them. And to maintain it and sustain it is tough as well, especially with the current government that are trying to revert on the Human Rights Act.
Yeah, one of the things that really struck me is when you talked about the golf courses as well. They didn't want their their clubs to be contaminated by women coming into the spaces.
Yeah. My son keeps reminding me of the acronym of golf: gentlemen only, ladies something. I can't remember what the F stands for, but in the book, I simply make that point that it's, again, it was that contamination effect, that if women suddenly came in to the golf clubs, it wouldn't be the place for men to network or whatever. And of course, we realized that was where the bar license was from taxation. And so no matter how much they said they were a private club, they couldn't have a bar unless the government gave them a license. And that's how the clubs then had to open up to women. And that was all in my time, in my day.
Yeah.
Those are little tiny pieces of the book. But, you know, I also talk about how I taught the police and how they wouldn't allow women police officers during the Troubles to be full-time officers with equal pay. And because the chief constable thought they should be wearing skirts, and wearing a skirt and carrying a gun didn't go together. And that case went all the way to the European Court as well and cost £1 million, and women were compensated.
Wow.
And today, women make good police officers.
Yeah.
It wasn't the case then.
The book is also filled with so many lovely anecdotal stories about marches that you were part of and movements that you contribute to. And, you know, there's a width of names of people who we won't have time to chat about tonight. But one of the lovely parts I thought that was really interesting was the women's studies course that you created. And it was funny, on Facebook today, there was somebody on one of the things we posted saying, "Oh, I did Monica's women's studies course in Derry years ago, great woman." But it really seemed to have a big impact. And that, you know, what was the kind of drive towards that? And
well, I'm glad you asked me that. When I, because my training was actually in, as I say, in a chapter of the book, in Detroit as an urban planner. And I came back and that's what I was teaching. But I could see all the Shankill was being redeveloped. There was a lot of mistakes being made. But the biggest mistake I could see also was that women had a huge say in and should have had a huge say on how they wanted their community to be developed, how they wanted to participate in leadership positions in local community committees, but they weren't getting the opportunity. And so I designed a course, which I could have been called for growing women leaders in local communities. Instead, we called it the Certificate in Women's Studies. And I went out around the communities, and it was a most brilliant harvest of talent that was sitting there in front of me. And what they needed was childcare places. I think I say the 4 C's: childcare, confidence, the culture, and cash. The 4 C's, those were the things that were missing. And so I developed a program kind of trying to tackle those hurdles. But also in that chapter, putting gender on the agenda. I also had to take on the management of the university to get that course and to get those childcare places, but also to put it on in Derry, which never had the same opportunities as Belfast. And once it got going, it went out into the regional colleges and it took off. And those were unbelievable students. They were coming back as mature students and going back into their communities. At a time when many of their partners were in prison. Many of them, unfortunately, as a result of taking the courses, were splitting up from their husbands, because their husbands resented the fact that they were getting educated and wanted them back the way you were before. And so I talk about all of that in that chapter, that the changes in their lives, but how they were very appreciative. And they used to give me a big cake as they graduated after the program with the feminist symbol on it. And these were women who you wouldn't have identified probably as feminists in the mid-80s. But of course, having done a certificate in women's studies, and how we had to wake the beast. I love your title. Because there were no texts for them to read. There was no plays. There was very little arts. And we had to set down ourselves and create a scholarship around new texts. And I think the Field Day anthology had been produced. And the first 3 volumes had concentrated on male writers and artists. And we said, right, let's write volume 4. And Seamus Dean, who was editing it, said, go for it. And that's how we got a whole collaboration, North and South, East and West, with the diaspora and everybody involved writing volumes 4 and 5. It ended up being 2 volumes. On Desert Island Discs, I asked for that to be the book that I could take to the island. Because I know it's so big, I never got a chance to read the whole thing. But it was something then for the students to fall back on. And we then developed a master's degree as well. But those things go, if there's not the resources, as you know, in the world you're operating in, you might have all good creative ideas and initiatives, but someone has to back you.
Yeah.
And if those institutions don't back you and don't keep the resources, and unfortunately, it depended too much on 1 or 2 of us taking it forward. And when I left and went into politics, the courses disappeared.
Wow. Yeah. I was going to say to you actually as well, one of the chapters which I found really difficult was the chapter whenever you were talking about domestic violence and how you were commissioned to write that report. I found that really, some of the stories within that, I found that really difficult to read. Yeah.
And I found it difficult to write, but they're all so true, those stories. And I took a bit of heart last week in Coleraine. I went into the bookstore and the guy behind the counter said to me, your book's doing well. And I really liked that chapter. And I thought he was going to say, which most people say, the chapter on the Good Friday Agreement. And he said, I really like that chapter on domestic violence. He said, my mother was a victim. And I thought, wow, that's, incredible. Well, we do know that 1 in 4 probably do have family members, so therefore they do know someone. But it was so silenced and so kept quiet in a corner. It was always them over there. It's not somebody over here. And that's what I wanted to explode, that myth, and hence the title. The first book I wrote and the first academic research I did was on domestic violence, a big study that I was commissioned to do. And I did not know that the impact of the conflict was having such an impact on domestic violence. And I talk about the use of guns and how many women were being killed, but also the Russian roulette, where they were pretending they had bullets in the guns. And, you can imagine how that would do your head in.
Oh God, yeah.
And that was all power and control. So I called it Bringing It Out in the Open. That's the title of the book. And the title of the chapter, that chapter is Bringing It Out in the Open. And most of it is about cases, because I thought, how do I make this interesting for the reader? Because it's a bit of a jump in a memoir to go from talking about the troubles outside the door on the streets to the troubles inside that no one was seeing. And so I told it through case studies. And I wrote that chapter from the individual cases and the women who I'd gone to court with, who I'd worked with through Women's Aid, and still am working with, and some of the women who ended up in prison. And just to bring it out in the open. And it's amazing how others now identify with that chapter. And so it brings it out in the open even more, because in Northern Ireland, we were more conservative, more patriarchal, more traditional, it was something you didn't talk about. You make your bed, you lie in it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to share one of those stories, Monica, because when I say it was difficult to read, felt very important to read as well. Because of the Troubles, if a woman was being assaulted and called the police, they would have to first verify that the call was genuine. I visited a woman who had lived on a farm in County Tyrone and had called the police after an attack. Just as I had been asked to call back, she was asked to do the same. But before she could, her husband had smashed the phone. She had run across the fields to a neighbour's to make the second call. The police finally arrived by helicopter, and the woman's young daughter described the scene to me, saying, "The policemen took my daddy up into the sky." This wasn't El Salvador, it was Northern Ireland in 1992. Even if the police had come by road, they would arrive in a convoy of heavily armoured vehicles with their army escorts holding submachine guns. These visits were anything but discreet. The neighbours could see the police coming from a mile off, and that added to the caller's stress. Unbelievable, isn't it, when you think of that? But of course.
And you know, the thing that we could commend them for was they came. They came by helicopter. But
Yeah.
that's why I wanted to say, and this wasn't El Salvador. Like, who would think in the United Kingdom's, in a region of the United Kingdom called Northern Ireland, that the police would have to respond by helicopter? Or that any woman picking up the phone would have to wait 10 minutes and then phone again because the police couldn't respond in case it was a false call and that their life would be in danger. In other words, if it was someone in the Republican community who was trying to kill them and they were luring them out because of domestic violence, and hence the reason why they came with armored cars and army. And if a woman would say, well, if my neighbor didn't know before, she certainly knew after. So that's what we were dealing with. And hence the reason why those community leaders and the women's leaders, and indeed even the clergy, became intermediaries. And that's when I realized I needed to start training the clergy. Because if they were the first point of contact, they were a very important point of contact and needed to understand the context. And the most nervous experience I ever had was standing preaching from a pulpit in West Belfast, in a Catholic church, to the congregation on domestic violence. And I just had to steel myself for that particular piece of public speaking. But afterwards, there was a great amount of training went on, you know, with the police, the court service, the judiciary, and the clergy. And they brought out where home is where the hurt, when home is where the hurt is. And it began to filter down. And today it's a completely different response.
Yeah.
Then it was keep the families together at all costs. And what the question I asked is, at what cost? And so I'm glad to say I've lived long enough this week and last week to see this massive amount of legislation go through the Assembly. All on domestic violence, on stalking, on near fatal strangulation, on coercive control, one piece of legislation after the other, because the Assembly is about to, well, it has now closed for the elections. But I'm sitting there watching all of this and thinking, wow, it took us 20 years to get there. And then in 1 week, 3 pieces of legislation, one after the other, goes through.
I mean, that's a striking kind of contrast to when you talk about going around the pubs in Derry, you know, collecting for Women's Aid in the, you know, the 70s, to see that kind of how there has been progress made.
Yeah. And what I liked about that was, Adam, is that poem that I included is from my good friend Avla, who was with me in Women's Aid, and they opened the first refuge in Derry, and they had to squat in it because social services didn't think there was a problem. And herself and Kathy Harkin, who coined the term armed patriarchy, took over this house, and they got mattresses and beds, and within a week within that first year, they had 300 children and I think over 60 families come through their doors. But Avla's poem about collecting the money, I thought was really powerful. So it's very strange in a memoir, perhaps, to include poetry, but I wanted to do that. And I'm glad, because it gives a better sense of the atmosphere of what it was like, and the jokes that we had to put up with when we were doing those collections.
It's very evocative. I mean, moving forward a little bit, Monica, because you and I could gab all day, I think, but I am aware there's a lot of ground to cover. And so you can see the seeds of all the work that you did within the Women's Coalition. And, during the peace talks, you can see, having read the book, you can see where all those roots came from because of the activism and the experience that you had in all your formative years. But let's just move on to the Women's Coalition now. So, I love this idea of, I would love you to tell us how we got to the Women's Coalition, because I love that little story where the image of you guys having a glass of wine on the Lisburn Road when you made that decision, right, I think we better put a political party together and run for elections. How did you get to that point?
Again, it was with my good friend Avla, and we had been looking at who was allowed to stand. And we had the ceasefires in place. Clinton had made his visit to Northern Ireland. And certainly the atmosphere was definitely changing. And these peace talks came out of nowhere, that we were going to have peace negotiations. The two governments were going to be at the table for the first time ever in history. And we realized how incredibly important it was. And we said, look, that is going to be a table full of men. And whatever women have done in the last 20 years here, they have earned their place to be at that table. And maybe we could just push the door open a little bit by suggesting to them that they want to open up that list of parties to new parties. And even the Green Party was starting to come into the fore at that stage. And we called them. Well, we sat down first in that cafe, and as you do with one glass of wine, it led to another one, and we started dreaming big things and said, well, why don't we try it? And I said, it sounded great that night. And some man came up and said to us, you two look so animated. What are you doing? And we said, we're changing the world. But the next day we had to wake up and think, now, how do we put that into practice? And that's when the phone calls started and the meetings started. And it was a whirlwind because we had 6 weeks to do it. We'd no office, we'd no money, we'd no posters, we'd no manifesto. But we did it and we pulled it off. And 6 weeks later, we got elected. And we weren't the last party. We were the 9th. And the government's intentions, Adam, was to bring in the 2 small loyalist parties affiliated to the 2 armed groups, the UVF and UDA. And we figured, well, they won't have the biggest vote in the world. And perhaps all the work that women have invested in the ground, as I called it, our pre-existing network. And it was incredible. Now, we came in for a lot of hostility. We were told, where did you lot come from? As if we fell out of the sky. We were told, and I quote in the book, the 2 leaders, that we were a cult and we would disappear, or that we should be like proper housewives who stand by their men and let the men do the politics. The same thing that I hear in other conflict situations. And that just made us even more angry. We got a bit of spirit into us. And we said, well, even if we don't get elected, we'll have raised the flag that the other parties should include women in their delegations. And it came as a total shock when it turned out that we were the 9th party and we were coming home, and the Belfast Telegraph ran a headline, "Hen's party comes home to roost."
Well, I think if I had to pick a favorite chapter, it would be that one, because it's just, you almost don't believe how it came into being. It's such a brilliant mixture of chance and, there's a certain amount of naivety, but wisdom at the same time, and just sheer, power of force, really.
Yeah. Remember, Adam, that many of us had children. My kids were 6 and 8. And, I didn't know whether to be embarrassed or proud when I took out the kitchen ladders and hung up those pathetic posters. And the teacher would go by and hit the car horn and wave. And I thought, oh, I hope she doesn't say anything in Gavin's classroom this morning about where she saw his mother. And she did. And he was proud. But those are the things as a mother you would worry about. And so we had busy lives, is the other point. But the thing, as you saw when you read that chapter, I hope you did, was the atmosphere of just chaos of what it took to come from literally having nothing in terms of organization to eventually realizing you were going to be the delegates to some of the most important peace negotiations that would ever take place on this island.
Yeah, unbelievable. Although almost wasn't. So I'm keeping you grounded here with a little paragraph that struck me. This is when you were running for your forms to put in to register. So you had to register your candidates for the elections. You didn't realize how long it was going to take you to fill the details of the candidates and their constituencies. So you were all on your hands and knees on the floor writing down the addresses. When you realized the time, it was an hour before the deadline for lodging the papers at the electoral office. And we had to get up from the Ulster People's College to the city centre. Our car came to a standstill outside the Europa Hotel. I wasn't sure whether it was a traffic jam or a bomb scare, but either way, I knew I had to get out of that car and start running. So I took off in the direction of Royal Avenue, forms in hand, and I was surprised how fast I could still run when I had to, even though I wasn't entirely sure of the exact location of the office. I was thinking of what I was going to have to say to the candidates because I had let the whole thing go down the tubes by not keeping an eye on the clock. One of our younger members was running beside me, shouting directions to Cathedral Square. So I kept going until I spotted Mary Blood pacing up and down outside the electoral office. As I turned the corner, Mary gestured for me to slow down. I could see the television cameras and slowed down to a walk at the office door. She was telling reporters that we had left it to the last minute on purpose, and she whispered to me that she was ready to kill me. I handed the papers to the security guard and hoped the press didn't hear him when he said, "Don't be giving those to me, love. You need to get them upstairs yourself." We took those stairs two at a time, lodging the papers a minute before 5 o'clock. Anything was possible after that.
True. Yeah. That was the kind of chaos. Yeah. And, May Blood is a well-known name here. And for May Blood, who would probably be in her late 60s at that stage, to take those stairs two at a time was some going.
Wow. I mean, just as I said, that chapter is just incredible. But what really came through to me was the amount of blood, sweat, and tears you had to do. I mean, putting ladders up lamp posts, and after every election, going back out, then not even enjoying the win, but going back out till 4 a.m., getting the ladders up again because you needed to get the hardboards for the back of the next campaigns for the assembly elections. I mean, when you think those guys deserve a glass of wine, you were all, it was such a, it's an incredible 7 years that's described in the book. But I'm just interested to talk, once you got into the talks, I mean, I think many people on this call tonight will remember a lot of the vitriol that you faced and the complete misogyny and sexism that you faced once you did get into the talks. Can you tell us a wee bit about that, Monica?
Yeah, and in many ways, Adam, like many who face insults and abuse, I wanted to forget about it. I'd locked it away and I'd moved on with my life when I came to write the book. And so I had to go back and remember it. And it was awful. It was very misogynist. Shut up and sit down is the most polite thing that was ever said. And some of the stuff I couldn't put in the book. And because it was so awful, but also because of the fear of litigation, because the person might not have remembered saying it, but we did. We had an insult of the week notice board, which we put outside our office. And, being mooed at in a public forum where you're elected. And I was making a speech in agriculture, which I had consulted my father about because it was the time of the BSE crisis. And I knew that my facts were correct, but it wouldn't have mattered what I was saying. And being called a cow. But those were the easy ones. The other ones were just such a difficult period. I mean, Paisley Sr. started a speech giving off about President Mary Robinson making a visit to Northern Ireland and said that she was a foreigner in a jurisdiction and she shouldn't have been there. And she had visited a women's centre that I had been working with, which got burned to the ground as a result. All the computers were burned. It was a shocking time. And I got up and he said, "You might as well be talking." And I quoted this, Adam, purposely because it was in Hansard. And I wanted to get it right because I knew what it was like to be sued for saying something that someone then said they didn't say. So everything in the book is actually what's on the record. So you can imagine what hit the cutting floor because it wasn't on the record.
Wow.
And so anything in there was about what was said publicly and recorded. And he said you'd be as easy negotiating with Hitler as you would with the government of the south of Ireland. And I got up and I asked him, the speaker, to make him take back those words that he was referring to Nazism in the Irish government. And he makes a comment, well, the honourable lady is living in cloud cuckoo land. And there's a burst of laughter, because again, it was a lonely space and a lonely place to be. And there wasn't another single person contesting what he had just said. So, what I say at the end of the book is, of course, people change and times change. But that was my entry into politics. And it's not like that today. Today, as I was traveling around, I was looking up at the posters, and the amount of women that are on the posters is phenomenal, standing in this election. But back then, as they say, we didn't have minders. We didn't have security when we went home at night. And Pearl, who was elected with me, was living in a predominantly majority, totally Protestant community, and was very worried about attacks. And eventually she had to move house.
I mean, you'll not like me for this, but I just looked at some of the things that you said in the book that about what you were called. You and Pearl, radical feminists, flat sandal, roll your own cigarette brigade. The woman wouldn't be able to make much of a contribution to this. She's a disgrace. Sit down, you silly woman. Sit down and shut up. Cloud cuckoo land, as you say, being mood. Typical little housewife. The only table you should be at is the one you're polishing. The women's clan, you were called whores. Get back to the kitchen where you belong. Bunch of feminists. Back to the kitchen. I could go. You'll not be coming to me for a feel good, and I won't be putting that on a t-shirt for you. But I mean, it just serves to highlight just what you guys were up against at that time.
Yeah, and we had to prepare ourselves each Friday, because the peace talks were taking place in private. And needless to say, Senator Mitchell, had a kind of aura of gravitas where that kind of behaviour wasn't as obvious. And we were also in a smaller room. This was a public forum where all those things were said and recorded. And also I had kept diaries and I'd kept minutes. And some of those were also said at the peace table. So you might ask yourself, what were they negotiating if those kinds of things were being said at the peace table? But on the Friday, I felt it was like a therapy, a venting exercise for those predominantly unionists, men, all men, who were let out on a Friday into the Forum for Dialogue and Understanding, which we renamed the Forum for Monologue and Misunderstanding. And each Friday morning, as I drove down in my car, I felt I physically had to put on my body armor, because I knew what I was walking into. But it kind of got that out into the open again, that this would have to also be part of the transition, that those attitudes could not be tolerated, nor would not be tolerated if we were going to move from conflict into peace. But as we know, the conflict that was being focused on was the guns and the demobilization of armed groups and all of that, and less the attitudes that were being used to subordinate the role of women in political life and in leadership positions.
I love that the SDLP had walked out. I think Sinn Féin maybe hadn't gone to that particular forum, but I think I remember you guys having a phone call saying, this is not on. Like, why would we stand here, get abuse every Friday? But you said it was because you wanted the visibility of women being in politics, and to have that as a visual message for other women felt like it was worth it.
Yeah. There was one day when I was physically shoved out of the road and verbally abused. And I made a call to May Blood again and said, I think it's time for us to leave. And she said, look, it's the place where we're getting access to journalists. People are finding out about us. And although it's pretty hateful what we're having to put up with, or you're having to put up with, the public are getting to see this stuff. And we've got a voice. And that voice will stand us in good stead. And we can't get our message out as strongly because of the confidentiality of the peace talks. So let's use this forum to get our message across, that both in terms of the substantive issues around the constitutional issues, around the governance of the future of Northern Ireland, the integrated education issue, the need for a civic forum, all the things that we wanted to put into the peace agreement, that we used that public forum to do it. And it didn't go down well because, as I said, the Nationalist Party, the SDLP, had left. Sinn Féin didn't take up their seats because in that first year they weren't allowed to go to the talks because they hadn't reinstated their ceasefire. And in any case, they saw the forum as a part of the British establishment because it went through Westminster's legislation and we still hadn't reached a peace agreement. So their seats were left empty. And as a consequence, we felt often, apart from the Alliance Party, who were beside us, their seats were beside us, we felt quite isolated down in that forum. But I'm glad we stayed, even though we often told Mo Mowlam that she should pack it up. I think it was Mark Durgan described it as a Fisher-Price Parliament.
Wow. Monica, I do want to get into the peace talks a little bit more and the eventual signing of the Good Friday Agreement. But I just wanted to, and we started a wee bit late, so we might continue a wee bit later if that's all right with everybody. People have to drop out, they can drop out. But I just do want to refresh our memories because it's such an evocative time in all of our history. So I'm just going to play like a short little 2-minute video just to refresh people's memories. And there's a few pictures of you, Monica, over the years as well. So let me just check if I now there's this awkward bit, you just have to tell me if you can see it or not. Okay, I hope this works.
On Women, War and Peace too.
The British and Irish governments have announced a firm date for the start of all party negotiations on the Northern Ireland peace process.
I'd never been in a political party before in my life. It wasn't politics, it was peace that I wanted.
We had to prove that it wasn't about sitting around a table and just talking about women's issues. It was about basic human rights issues for the whole of Northern Ireland.
We go marching, marching in the beauty of the day. A million darkened kitchens, 1,000 mill lofts gray, are touched with all the radiance that a sudden sun discloses. For the people hear us singing, bread and roses, bread and roses. As we go marching, marching, we battle too for men, for they are women's children, and we mother them again. Our lives shall not be sweated from birth until life closes. Hearts starve as well as bodies. Give us bread, but give us roses. As we go marching, marching, unnumbered women dead, go crying through our singing.
Yes, 71.12%.
And love and beauty, their trudging spirits new. Yes, it is bread we fight for, but we fight for roses too.
So I'm sure that brought back a few memories for everyone. I got a little shiver down the back of my neck there. Monica, you talk in the book, and it's really, I'm sure if anyone's got questions as well about the peace process and the talks, please put it into the chat and I'll feed it back in. But I would like to ask you to tell me a little bit about there were some trips that you went on, and that was so interesting, where barriers came down when people were outside of the country and in different situations. And the one that just really struck me, and I heard you speak about this a few years ago at Queen's, was about this trip to South Africa when Mandela invited everyone over to South Africa. Are you okay to tell us a little bit about that and how that had an impact?
Yeah, that was 3 life-changing days in terms of the peace talks for me, and I know it was for other parties who we can now talk about that all these years later. we were taken secretly and to Johannesburg and then transferred by helicopter, no, by small plane and with blacked out windows. Had no idea where our passports were because they were taken off us in Johannesburg and not returned until many days later. But we knew that Mandela was going to be with us for 3 days, as were de Klerk's people, Buthelezie's people, even the people who were opposed to the changes that were coming in the National Party in South Africa. So it was really important that we sat there and listened. And the army of the South African Defence Force and MK, which had been the military wing of ANC, were present. And so we listened to them about decommissioning and demobilisation. This was the year before the peace agreement, and Sinn Féin were present, but because the IRA had not reinstated their second ceasefire, they came by separate plane, and everything had to be done in twos. And Mandela had to do his talk twice, and he actually said, "You've brought apartheid back to South Africa."
And Monique, can I just interrupt you? That's because the Unionists wouldn't sit with Sinn Féin.
That's correct.
So everything had to be done twice, two of everything. It's unbelievable.
Yes, and then I tell a story in the book, which at the time I probably had to be careful about, which is the Loyalists had not met Sinn Féin. And it was very important that they talked face to face. And I asked if they would, and they said they could, because their leaders had been in prison, and they said nobody could call us traitors. And so I gave them the key to my bungalow, and I went for a walk, and they went off and had their very important discussions. And there's also funny stories there, because the DUP had never met Sinn Féin's delegates, so they didn't know who the two women were. And Gregory Campbell, MP for Northern Ireland still, and Edwin Poots, who's now the Minister for Agriculture, were merrily chatting away with Rita O'Hare and Siobhan O'Hanlon, the two delegates from Sinn Féin, and had around the bonfire, and had no idea until the penny dropped. And then they had to go very quickly to tell Peter Robinson to move out of the scene in case any photographs were taken. Photographs were a big thing, Adam. And you will recall a very funny story at the baseball game in Boston, where separate tickets had to be bought also, because people wouldn't sit together. And I say that they got separate tickets to watch a match, or to watch a game in blissful ignorance about which they knew nothing about, but they were very happy as long as they were in separate parts of the stadium. So it took us a long time to implement that peace agreement, because people hadn't built the relationships. They hadn't said good morning to each other. They felt, and David Trimble has often said it during those peace talks, he thought it was a strength not to engage with his opponents. And that continued for such a long time because there hadn't been decommissioning. And it almost wrecked the process. And it certainly wrecked the implementation of the process for the first 10 years. But Mandela was right. If you didn't, and I wrote in the book the messages he gave us, and it was about building human relationships and developing that chemistry, which they did. And of all the people to develop that, it was Mandela himself. So for me, it was a very privileged 3 days. And I sat there and listened and took it all in, and came home hoping that we would see changes, and the IRA reinstated its second ceasefire a week after we arrived in Northern Ireland. So I would say that they also had a profound effect on them. And they stayed at the table, and the other parties, the DUP walked out, as we now know, and it was another 10 years before they came back to sit down with Sinn Féin and form a coalition government.
And Monica, on that trip to South Africa, you're talking about all quite prominent politicians then, who were...
Yes, all the leaders of the parties. And that was the reason why we went, because the ground rules were that it had to be at the leadership level.
Yeah.
And South Africans agreed that theirs too would be at the leadership level, at the highest level.
Yeah.
And so, to be locked up for 3 days in a military camp sounds like a pretty awful thing. And not to be able to phone your kids sounds even worse, because phones weren't allowed because nobody was to tell the media. But actually, to be locked up in a military camp with Mandela was a pretty good thing.
Wow. And then take us forward then to that last kind of burst of, because it seemed there were so many ups and downs, which you narrate really interestingly through the book. But that last burst of energy just before Easter seems like it was really something quite, I mean, the intensity, it's reading I knew what was the outcome, but I still felt like it was a roller coaster when I was reading that chapter.
Yeah, well, I wanted to give that sense to people who think that making that peace agreement was, well, everybody knew it was going to be difficult, but it was incredibly tense and very stressful. 1 minute it was on, and then it was off, and then it was back again, for another party was unhappy, and another party had to be made happy. The Taoiseach's mother had died just the 3 days of that last week. So he was dealing with going to her wake, going down to Dublin by airplane, and coming back up that same night, going back down again for the funeral, and making a huge decision about changing what the Irish government had signed up to, because Articles 2 and 3 were being bartered in terms of, okay, we will give those up if there's going to be a recognition of self-determination about the island of Ireland in the future in terms of a referendum. All the things that we're still pretty unsettled about at the minute, but those were big decisions.
Yeah.
Because they were going to have to change their constitution. And likewise, the Unionists were having a nightmare over the North-South bodies and about this North-South Council. Was it going to be an executive council? Was it going to be making decisions about the Northern Ireland executive? So all those arrangements, and I didn't want to bore the reader by showing that they were quite important about where you put the comma and how you drafted the sentence in a way that didn't upset one side or the other. So we were running around the corridors, up and down the stairs, all night for 3 nights. And I then say Mo Mowlam was certainly the hero of that process, because she had an intravenous drip in her arm. She was in her bare feet. She'd taken off her wig, and she was flying between the rooms, picking up pieces of information. And then I say the pieces that I had picked up through teaching women's studies all those years ago, it turned out that one of them was the wife of the chairperson of Sinn Féin, and he had been very grateful to me, and he was able to take me into his confidence, and in turn I took Mo into mine. Those are the things that makes negotiations work.
So
Facilitation, mediation, negotiation. They're all different skills, but as I said, the Women's Coalition had all 3 sets of those skills, and some became facilitators, some were mediators at a time when parties were refusing to speak to each other, and some of us, I had turned myself into the spokesperson and constantly that night run in and out to climb up a ladder on scaffolding to speak to CNN, who had built a kind of treehouse, as I thought it was. And, I was wearing high heels, so it wasn't the easiest thing in the middle of it all to scamper up a ladder and scamper back down a rope ladder, run back into the building and keep on negotiating. So I wanted to give a real sense of what that was like to the reader.
Yeah.
And finally, we get called, and then we're told, no, stand down, it's over. And then that afternoon, we're told, it's back on, get to the table and fast. And you're only going to be allowed to say, I am in favour. That's all you're going to be allowed to say until we get round every party. And once every party has declared that they're in favour and the 2 governments declare they're in favour, Senator Mitchell said, I will then say, it's done. And that was 5:15 on Good Friday.
And how did that feel when he said that?
Well, you've just shown the pictures. And I had said, as I say in the book, I'd said to the women when they came onto the room, we're the only women at the table, so please don't be crying. If this, historical moment comes, because this is what the cameras will catch, and they'll catch the men being really serious and standing up. The men all started, not all of them, many of them started to cry. And I turned to the women and I said, well, we can cry now if you want. And what you caught there was men and women crying and putting their arms around each other. And I think I tell in the book, I can't recall if I tell in the book, an incredible poignant moment that Avila reminded me of with Joe Cahill, who was well-known IRA leader, leaning on the back chair of a loyalist member who had been affiliated to an armed group. And he was leaning on it to help him stand because it was going to be quite a long session and he was elderly. And I think I say in the book, would this be the way of things in the future?
Wow. The thing that really struck me was after all of that, you were absolutely knackered. You made your way home and you said to your son when you got home, Mum has been part of making peace. And I can't remember which one of your sons it was said, yeah, but that's your job, isn't it? He was nonchalant.
Yeah, and he went on skating down the street on a skateboard.
And by all accounts, you had a good night's sleep that night anyway. I mean, we won't get to cover everything because time is against us, but I do want to, it's very interesting in the how you narrate the assembly, then the assembly elections, and we narrate the referendum first of all, and then the assembly, and the kind of, the ups and downs of that is really interesting, because again, we all lived through that. But when it came to a natural point, it felt like you called yourself an accidental politician, and you got to the end of the first assembly, and then the Women's Coalition were not elected to the next one. That's when the polarization really happened, where Sinn Féin and the DUP then kind of sucked up all the smaller parties, and that's where we kind of have stayed there since then, really.
Yeah. What that taught me, and I try in the book to pull out the lessons, is the spirit of the peace agreement. We should have moved fast. And instead, we let stalemate set in and we started rows over decommissioning. And people should have made a bigger attempt to meet each other, and the main parties. And the assembly collapsed and didn't come back in 2003 for another 4 years. So that was the period in which there was nothing. And my period I talk about those 5 years when I was elected, which again, I couldn't believe I was elected in my own right here in this constituency of South Belfast. I was then having to do constituency business as well as the big peace agreement business. And that's what I say in that chapter. It was very bitter politics because the anti-agreement people, it's easy to say no. It's difficult to explain what you've said yes to. And that's why I wanted to put in that chapter that people think it was the referendum, people went out and just struck their vote. It was hard work up here, getting people to say yes, because some people thought it was a terrorist charter, letting prisoners out. Others thought there wasn't a word in it about victims. And the Women's Coalition had been forward enough thinking to put in clauses about the victims and what we would do. And now you can see that that's these days has become a huge issue about the legacy and how we deal with the veterans, and also how do we get truth and justice. So those were powerful issues that needed to be resolved and weren't. And then eventually the guns were given up and the parties agreed to go into power sharing and into mandatory coalition. And there's still problems around that, as we now see. But it's an unfinished business and we keep working at it. So that last chapter, and as I come towards the last chapter, I try to make the connections between Northern Ireland and other parts of the world. And also to be very clear about what you've signed up to deliver on your promises. And for us, not to put too many aspirations in, to make them institutional guarantees. And I say I went on to be the Chief Commissioner, and it fell to me, mandated by the agreement to draft the Bill of Rights advice. I did do that, and I presented it to Westminster in 2010 to the Prime Minister, and it's sitting gathering dust in Downing Street ever since. And there's another promise that wasn't delivered on. And now with Brexit, and now, as I said at the beginning of our talk tonight, with the Human Rights Act being revised because of the European issue. So we may lose rights that we have, which is not good for Northern Ireland, because whatever we've learned is that the way to make peace is also to have some foundational rights where we respect each other's rights, even if you don't agree with their politics. So those were all the lessons that I tried to make between that period and the final chapter. And sometimes telling funny stories in between, so that all the time, and this is the roller coaster you were on, it was serious business, but what saved us was our good humor at times. And in that assembly, you can see some of the humor that was exchanged and very, very serious times.
Mm.
And people would then just make a comment that would break the tension.
Folks, because we're coming up to the last couple of minutes, so I do want to get in any questions as well. It'd be lovely to talk or to get. I can put some quick fire questions in, but just those last two chapters that you talk about, Monica, are such an interesting trajectory of how you continued in that ethos of human rights. But really, one of the things that struck me really was so inspiring was how you've been able to hold up the peace process that was created in Northern Ireland as a beacon of excellence, which has been an inspiration for people in different parts of the world, which I don't know, for as someone living in the diaspora, and you hear lots of negative things about Northern Ireland, we don't celebrate that enough. It just seems like such a beautiful opportunity for us to take something of excellence that we created and to spread that throughout the world.
Yeah, I'm very glad you made that point, because in the chapter, I don't say that we were a model of perfection, because peace is never perfect, and that we made mistakes, but it's one of the few peace agreements that has stayed and is still being implemented. And that's really important internationally. And for the United States, it was a good foreign policy lesson. And so they use it a lot. The European Union got the Nobel Peace Prize on the back of it. John Hume, David Trimble, likewise. And also it is carried into other places in the world in terms of what was agreed and how to agree it. And I've been to Colombia many times over the 20 years leading up to their peace agreement, and was amazed at the extent to which President Santos was using Northern Ireland as a model. But also I was engaged with FARC, the guerrilla movement, and the government negotiators, and was amazed to hear them saying, especially the women, how much they had learned from the Women's Coalition. I didn't know any of that, because often in your own country, as you probably know, you don't hear that. You hear about the negativity and the things that aren't working, and what you hear in other countries is the positivity. And so I think that should be celebrated. And I'm on the John and Pat Hume Foundation, and John Hume was clearly, his record was about the importance of recognizing difference. And internationally, he's a well-known figure. And I think the Irish government are very much in support of using it as a model, and know the British government now are doing likewise, or did, and I hope they continue to do it, in terms of conflict resolution. So that's what I find when I go elsewhere, and that last chapter concentrates on that. And what I say in that chapter too was, again, the sadness of war has the face of the woman. And we can see that now again in Ukraine and Syria. And what happens when you have a demagogue, and the whole tension about, is it possible to negotiate with a partner who is using violence and military means, and another partner whose word isn't good. So there was lots of lessons in it, but what I wanted was to end on a good note, and to show how important it was to hold on to our belief that we can do this, that we can make this work. As I said at the time of the agreement, we'd interrupted the culture of failure, that we make it so we don't break it. And that's kind of the note I wanted to leave with people.
Lovely. There's a couple of quick questions coming in, Monica, if you're all right, just to take some of these. One is about the future with assembly elections coming up in May, how you're feeling about the future, what your thoughts are. And then another question kind of linked is about the influence of the Women's Coalition, looking at how, recently we had a First Minister, female First Minister, Arlene, and Michelle, a Deputy First Minister. And as you said earlier, lots of female faces on the election posters. How much do you think the Women's Coalition were a force for inspiration for where we are?
Well, you could look at it two ways. One, the other parties realised the opportunity there is if you put more women into your parties, and they saw that from the Women's Coalition. And they responded then by promoting women up their ranks and putting them into safer seats where they had a chance to get elected. So that was good. The other could be the contagion effect, that when you see women breaking into something like what we've done, that it's possible. Because what we had heard before that was women weren't interested, or we don't know any women that want to be politicians. Well, we proved that wrong, and that's the contagion effect, that's the legacy effect. So I'm very pleased. If that's all, that's good. And then obviously the leadership decisions. But if people said, oh, you have two women leaders in the two big parties and they didn't get on very well. Well, they're also having lots of constituencies behind them that tell them what to do and how to lead their community. And that's the same for men as it is for women. So the expectations, like President Obama, the expectations are so high that you can't always meet them. But I do think it's really important for representation reasons, for role model reasons, for participation of those young women coming behind us, that the Women's Coalition was there. And I'm glad if that's all the legacy. And the other one was about the Assembly. Yes, people will get voted. I hope it's not a bitter election, but it's the same negativity. You must vote for our tribe because the other tribe could dominate and we can't afford that. So that's not a good manifesto to simply stand on what you should be against. I'm very much looking forward to seeing how the bread and butter issues will dominate this election compared to previous elections, because we've now got austerity, we've got cost of living increases, we've got the Ukraine war in terms of electricity, gas price, but also I think we should be focusing on what a war in Europe compared to the issues we're dealing with here, and how that will lead people to become more sensible about the Northern Ireland Protocol. But will the Assembly come back if we have a First Minister, according to the polling, who could become from Sinn Féin? Well, once again, they will have to get into dialogue and sit down, because that's democracy. And I think it may take time. And whether that takes months or a year is anyone's guess, but it's not good for Northern Ireland to have a vacuum. And that I know, because I'm working on the issue of measures towards progressing the ending of paramilitarism. And the only people that benefit from vacuums are those groups who never believed in the agreement in the first place, or those groups who have gone in the direction of criminality and gangsterism. And that's why you need good governance. And that's why you need people to say, violence doesn't work, politics has to. And hence my message would be that this Assembly needs to get back up and running.
Monica, last two questions. Just on the point, there's a question from Angela saying, how can we grow confident communities to challenge and reduce the influence of paramilitaries? What further support do you think is needed to achieve this?
I think our communities are very confident. My message to the diaspora tonight and people everywhere is, do not get too concerned about some of those idiots that are, I was at that meeting last Friday that had the van appear, hijacked van with explosives. They have very little support. And the message from our conflict is that you only keep violence going when a community supports it. The communities here have tasted the price of peace. They do not support those violent small groups, but there's an appetite for spontaneous violence in any community, but focus on the resilience. And if you're asking what has happened, a good part of what has happened is there's been investment from the diaspora, from the International Fund for Ireland in particular. And we're very fortunate that we have a diaspora like that. And there's also, and it goes directly into these communities, and they're able to take risks with that funding. And what it is about is, what I'm focusing on is keeping the next generation away from being the recruits of paramilitaries, not to aspire to that as a lifestyle, but to have prosperity and jobs. And that's where I see the confidence in the community coming. And that's what we have to work hard at getting, and I believe we will.
That's lovely. Well, just the last thing then, I was going to ask you what's next, but actually we've already said that I'm getting the film rights to your book, so we're making the film version of your life. So the last question is, who's going to play you in the film version of your life?
Well, somebody talked about that recently, and May Blood was very funny, and she said, well, since Ina Sharples is no longer with us on Coronation Street, that she won't be there to play her. So I have no idea, but yeah, it would be lovely. There is a film, by the way, and I can send the link to you and you can send it out to others, called Wave Goodbye to Dinosaurs. And it shows a lot of interesting footage and the role of the Women's Coalition. But this story, if you were talking to me tonight, is a much more extended story.
Yeah.
And so who knows? Yeah, Netflix made The Crown. So I hope, Adam, some of your people will get to make a different kind of film about the grassroots movement in Northern Ireland.
Well, let's hope so. Let's put that as as an ambition. Folks, thank you so much. I know we went over a little bit, but Monica, it's such a, there was so much we could have spoke about as well. It's just such a brilliant, you'd think I'm getting a commission from this book the way that I'm selling it. But as I said at the very beginning, it really just spoke to me, and it's just told with such charm and such comedy, but you're dealing with such interesting and poignant issues and ongoing topics. I do want to just really thank you, Monica. So I don't know if people are muted, but I just really want to say thank you so much for, I can see some people clapping there. I've got some messages in the chat. Many thanks for such an interesting presentation, Monica. Monica, you're so inspiring. So I really just want to thank you for taking the time and being here to present this to us.
Well, thank you, Adam. And the reason why I've enjoyed it so much is because you've been such a wonderful host. And thank you to Jodie. And thank you to all of you involved in Waking the Beast. It's a great title. And maybe that should be the title of the film. Instead of Wave Goodbye to Dinosaurs. But it's been lovely to talk to you tonight, and especially being brought back down memory lane. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monica. I really appreciate that. And just to remind everybody, again, these are part of a series of creative conversations. Our next one is next month. And that's with a foot in each island, and that's really focused on second generation Irish or Northern Irish. What does it feel like to be Irish with an English accent? We've got some, we're back to more traditional format. We've got some theatre performances, mixture with discussion and conversation as well. So folks, I really want to thank everybody. Monica, it was such an inspiration chatting to you. It was really lovely to hear your thoughts. And thank you everybody for being part of this tonight. I'm just going to ask for one more thing. I'm going to put a little link into the chat, which is just a bit of a feedback form. If you could fill that in, that'd be really great, because it gives us a sense of who's here and also how we can improve things or what you might like to hear about in the future. I'll probably email that out to people as well, but I put it in the link now, just so you've got that there. But I don't know, Judy, do you have anything else you want to? You're all good? Yeah,
Adam, I'm supposed to say, and I didn't, but I think the publishers would probably expect me to say, and the book is in all good bookshops.
Indeed.
And it's also online.
Indeed. I mean, absolutely, stand up, speak out. Yeah, it's in all good bookshops, and get your hands on a copy now, because we've just hit the tip of the surface for tonight. So there's loads more to get your teeth into. So thank you so much, everybody. We're going to wind this up now. And Monica, thanks again, and look forward to seeing everybody at future creative conversations. Thank you very much.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
All right.
In my memory, I will always see the town that I have loved so well, where our school played ball by the gas yard wall, and we laughed through the smoke and the smell. Going home in the rain, running up the dark lane, past the jail and down behind the fountain. Those were happy days in so many, many ways. In the town I love so well. In the